Okay, we're holding in Parshas Vayigash, Perek Mem Hey, Pasuk Zayin. Yosef tells the brothers, Vayishlacheni Elokim Lifnechem. And this is the second time that he attributes his being sent to Hashem. Second out of three. In Pasuk Hey he says, Shlachani Elokim Lifnechem. And then in Pasuk in the next pasuk, in pasuk Zayin, he repeats it a third time. Loi atem shlachtem oisi heino ki ho'elekim. So of course we have to understand why is it repeated three times, this notion that God sent him. I'm not going to explain that at this point. I just wanted to comment on that. Okay, so in pasuk Zayin he says that God sent me ahead of you, lifnechem. So it was important that I get here before you. And why was it important? Losum lachem she'eris ba'aretz u'lahachayos lachem lifleto gedolah. The fact that I was sent before you is what's going to ensure that there's a remnant and a pleta, a great pleta. In other words, what he's saying is that had Yosef not been sent ahead of the brothers, they would not survive. Okay, so we have to think about what this means. Why would they not survive? So maybe you'll think, Pashat. Because if the Rav in Mitzrayim would not have been alleviated through Yosef's plan, so the brothers wouldn't have survived. No one would survive. Well, the problem with this is that he's saying that Hashem sent me ahead of you to save you. He doesn't say Hashem sent me to save the whole Mitzrayim or to save the whole world. He's explicitly connecting it to them, which suggests that he's not saying that, I have to be here to save Mitzrayim. And in fact, Mitzrayim could have been saved in numerous ways. He seems to be saying that there's a special connection between him and them, that he has to be there before them. I'm here ahead of you to prepare for your coming. In other words, he's not saying that, look, since there's going to be a tremendous hunger, Hashem wanted me to be here because I'm going to save Mitzrayim and by extension, not just Mitzrayim, but the whole Canaan, including you. But rather, it's me being here before you, lifnechem, which is critical. So we have to understand, in what sense does he mean that if I wasn't here before you, you wouldn't survive? And in fact, the pasuk in Tehillim that paraphrases these psukim, in Tehillim Kuf Hey, Perek Yud Tehillim Perek Kuf Hey pasuk Yud Zayin. So it says Hashem declared a hunger. Sholach lifnehem ish kol mate lechem shavar. Vayikor Rav Alo it's kol mate lechem shavar. Sholach lifnehem ish le'eved nimkar Yosef. So he sent a man before them. Sholach lifnehem ish. In other words, because there's a Rav, there has to be someone who's there ahead of them. Not that the purpose of Yosef going to Mitzrayim is to protect Mitzrayim or everyone from the Rav, but rather it's important that there be someone lifnehem, just like the same focus over here. There's a special connection to them. So what is that? So, says the Ramban, that this is a continuation of the previous pasuk, where Yosef said there's going to be another 5 years without Charish v'Katzir. And what that means is then, says the Ramban, Yosef is saying not only were there 2 years of hunger till now, but there are another 5 years expected ahead of us where there's not going to be Charish v'Katzir. And who knows what's going to happen in those 5 years? Who knows if my plan that is what's there to alleviate the Rav from Mitzrayim is going to ensure that there's enough for everyone to survive another 5 punishing years of hunger without Charish v'Katzir. And therefore, if not for the fact that I'm here and you have protectia, you have a connection in Mitzrayim, you will not survive. The Ramban says, "Yu mesim v'lo yishar lehem she'eris, and lo yisiya lechem ba michya klal." That's what he reads. Kila michya shlachani elikim means, if I wasn't here, you would not live, because there's another 5 years of hunger coming. And he says that Yosef sent the same message to Yaakov, but he didn't say you'll die. Instead, in Pasuk Yud, he said penti varesh, you'll be impoverished, because they're covered to his father. He's not going to say you're going to die. Instead, he made it softer and said penti varesh. But essentially, he was predicting to the brothers that they're liable to die from the next 5 years of hunger, and a lot of people will die, because even though we made provisions and plans, it's not going to protect everyone from the hunger. There are going to be a lot of casualties. And what's going to ensure that you survive is that you have me, special connection to me, and I'm going to take care of you. So the fact that I'm here, lifnei is important, because we have to now face another 5 years of hunger, where it's going to prove to be crucial that I am here, I, your brother, have the power over the food, and therefore I can select you to be from the survivors of the next 5 years of hunger. Okay, so basically what we have to read is as follows. Yosef's theory of why Hashem sent him is because he's going to act in his position of power. He's going to act as being the one who's going to protect his brothers from the next 5 years of Rav. So again, just to be clear, the fact that Yosef saved Mitzrayim is not a theory why Hashem sent him before the brothers, because there's other ways to save Mitzrayim. We have to have a theory why Yosef, who doesn't really belong in Mitzrayim and really belongs with his brothers, has to be in Mitzrayim. And that theory is, that the Jewish people, his family, needed to have an insider in Mitzrayim, where he ostensibly doesn't belong, because that way they have a connection that will protect them from the great dangers that are up ahead. But what's so important then, what's so interesting then, is that if the Rav ended after 2 years, which is the what Chazal say when Yaakov came and blessed Paroi, the Rav was over. We spoke about this in the past. And what the sources for that are. The Ramban himself deals with that at the end of Parshas Vayigash, but we spoke about the fact that that means Yosef's prediction did not come true, and he said, Nochoin hadavar me'imhu elikim. That was not the case. It wasn't Nochoin. That was a mistake, as we discussed in the beginning of Parshas Miketz. And so what this means then is that not only Yosef's prediction, confident prediction, not only was his confident prediction ultimately proven to be false, but we also have to think about his theory of why Hashem sent him. His theory of why Hashem sent him is predicated on the fact that there are another 5 years where there's no Charish v'Katzir. But if in fact Yaakov is going to come to Mitzrayim, and Vayivorach Yaakov is Paroi, and as we discussed, once the Nidchei Yisrael Echanes, once the whole family is back together, then there's Hashem protects his Yirei of from the hunger, and you don't need the Gvuras Hasus and the Sheikh Ha'ish, you don't need Yosef's energy, Yosef the young man, as we discussed by Richos. So ultimately, Yosef's not the solution, not the salvation from the hunger. So now we have to say, well, why did Hashem send him ahead? Or is it not true, to state the question even sharper, is it not true that it was crucial that Yosef be sent ahead in order for Bnei Yisrael to survive? Stated simply, had Yosef not been sent ahead, would have Bnei Yisrael nonetheless survived. Okay, so what I want to show is the following. Or even stated more simply, knowing what we know, that they survived without Yosef's intervention, why in fact was it important for there to be Yosef to be sent to Mitzrayim ahead of them? And the fact is, the Pasuk in Tehillim does say, it's not just Yosef saying that Hashem sent me, it's a Pasuk in Tehillim. We can't say that Yosef is making a mistake, because the Pasuk in Tehillim, Kofei, says, Shalach lifnei ish. Hashem's plan, because there's a Rav, was to send a person ahead of them. And again, the point is that they're all going to eventually end up there, but it's important that he's there before, because what? He's going to take care of them. But like we said, that seems to be connected to the fact that there's 7 years of hunger expected, but that never materialized. So why do we need Yosef to be sent ahead of them? So again, it's not just Yosef saying it. We can ask this question on Tehillim. But if you look at the pasuk in Tehillim, it says Shalach lifneim ish. Again, this is in Tehillim Kufhei pasuk Yud Zayin. Sholach lifneihem ish le'eved nimkar Yosef. He sent someone ahead of them. Yosef was sold as an eved. So that pasuk suggests, the reading of that pasuk suggests that we're supposed to read Yosef going ahead of them, not in terms of the fact that Yosef is merely ends up living in Mitzrayim before everyone moves to Mitzrayim, but before everyone moved to Mitzrayim and eventually was enslaved, Yosef was in advanced enslavement, because Yosef was the first one to be enslaved in Mitzrayim, as we discussed in Parshas Vayeshev, where it talks about Yosef being sold and purchased as an eved. That's foreshadowing, and then eventually becomes free. That foreshadows the process of his brethren being enslaved in Mitzrayim and eventually being freed. So the pasuk in Tehillim then reads the following, as follows. There's this destiny for Bnei Yisrael to end up being slaves to Mitzrayim, and before the whole family ended up moving to Mitzrayim, where they were eventually enslaved. Before they went there, one of them was sent ahead of them and sold as an eved, and that is Yosef. Okay. So there's this idea that Yosef has to go ahead. Similarly, and just keep that in mind, and we'll explain. I'll try to pull this all together. Similarly, in Perek Memvav, pasuk Chav Ches, the pasuk says, "Ves Yehuda sholach lefonov el Yosef lahoros lefonov." So twice the pasuk stresses that Yehuda was sent lefonov, and Yehuda joined Yosef, who stressed that he was sent by Hashem lifneihem. Or he said, "Vayishlacheni Elokim lifneichem," and the pasuk in Tehillim, "Shalach lifneihem ish." Similarly, Yehuda had to be sent lifonov. So that means there's this movement of Bnei Yisrael to Mitzrayim, and the movement happens in parts, in stages. Yosef precedes them, and Yehuda also precedes them. And this we commented, I think, last year. Take a look at the pasuk in Micha, at the end of Perek Beis. Micha, the end of Perek Beis, comes right before the Perek, which is the words of Yosef to his brothers. Perek Gimel starts with Shimuna Rashi Yaakov. Shimuna, this echoes the Shimuna that Yosef said to his brothers, Shimuna Achalem Azasher Chalamti, and the message in Perek Gimel is a message against people that take advantage of the poor, as they did to Yosef. They stole his skin. V'chulu v'chulu. We don't have to review everything in Perek Gimel. We've referenced it all the time. I'm just telling you this so you should think about the last pasuk in Perek Beis also as having connection to the story of Yosef. And there it says the following. So start at Perek Beis, pasuk Yud Beis. It talks about She'eris Yisrael, that the She'eris Yisrael will be gathered together. Remember, Yosef told the brothers, you're going to have a She'eris Ba'aretz. So Micha Perek Beis, pasuk Yud Beis talks about She'eris Yisrael being gathered back to Eretz Yisrael, and the pirates going ahead of them, whatever that means. I have no idea. Doesn't concern us right now. And look at the end of the pasuk, Vaya'avar Malkom Lifneihem. Their king has to go ahead of them. V'Hashem B'Rosham. So again, what this is supposed to mean, I don't know. But comparing this to Parshas Vayigash, where we have Yosef and Yehuda both going ahead of Bnei Yisrael to Mitzrayim. Okay. Both of them are contending for kingship. And here we have this expression, paratz. We'll talk about that in a minute. And it's parallel to Amos. Okay, leave that for a moment, the word paratz. But the point is that in order for Bnei Yisrael to eventually have Hashem B'Rosham, because what happens to Bnei Yisrael is they go to Mitzrayim, they become Avadim, they leave Mitzrayim, and Hashem Hölech Lifneihem, as it says in this week's Parashat B'Shalach, Hashem Hölech Lifneihem. So before Hashem Hölech Lifneihem is the triumphant freedom of Bnei Yisrael, where they become Mamleches Koyanim. So they attain, which Mechilta says they attain the level of Malachim. So Bnei Yisrael all become Avadim and eventually leave Mitzrayim and are Malachim when Hashem is Holech Lifnei. The way Bnei Yisrael go through the process of Avdus, which turns into Malucha, is by virtue of the fact that their leaders, their internal leaders, in other words, all Bnei Yisrael become Malachim, but they have within them, they have Malachim of Bnei Yisrael, and those are either Yosef or Yehuda, and those two kings within Bnei Yisrael go Lifnei. They go to Mitzrayim before the Bnei Yisrael do, and that way, eventually, they achieve Hashem B'Reisham. Furthermore, Yosef, as the pasuk says, LaEved Nimkar Yosef, he's the Eved who turns out to be a Melech, turns into a Melech by virtue of being an Eved, as we discussed, that in order, the proper king is an Eved, which is what Rechavam's council told him. If you want to be a king, you have to be an Eved. So Yosef, in order to attain the virtue of kingship, had to go through the process of being an Eved. And similarly, Yehuda, when he's taking responsibility for his brother, which is what a king does, he offers to be an Eved. So that's when Yehuda and Yosef are on the same page. In other words, Yehuda, by offering to be an Eved because he's responsible, because he's an Arav, because he's the king who takes responsibility. Okay, as the pasuk says, "V'haya adiroi mimenu." We spoke about this pasuk. The adir, which means the king, will be from his midst. Ki mihu ze orav es liboy, because who can take a guarantee for something, take responsibility? So Yehuda taking responsibility is demonstrating kingship. And what does he offer? Because he's the king, he offers to be a slave, which is affirming that the true king is a slave, which is exactly what redeems what happened to Yosef, because he was sold as a slave. But that tells us that he actually, Taka was supposed to be the king. So ironically, the brothers who said, what, are you going to be the king? So what they do, they sold him as a slave. But by Yehuda offering to be a slave, because he recognizes that he's really responsible, which is what a king is, he actually is then indicating that selling their brother as a slave is what prepares him to be king. So tying that all together, here the pasuk says that the Melech, the pasuk in Micha says the Melech has to go Lifnei before them, and the pasuk in Tehillim says LaEved Nimka Yosef. Yosef was sold as an Eved before they were sold as an Eved, and Yehuda went before him, and Yehuda offered to be an Eved too at the beginning of Parshas Vigash. So that tells us what? That the function of Yosef going before them, Vayishlacheni Elokim Lifneichem, is about being an Eved. So what I'm getting at, and I'll explain this all very soon, is that Yosef, although Yosef was saying that Hashem sent me before you to protect you from the next 5 years of hunger, that was Yosef's mistake. He predicted there's going to be another 5 years of hunger. That was incorrect, and that's where Yosef went wrong, as we discussed in the beginning of Parshas Miketz. But his point about the fact that Hashem has a purpose in sending me before you, and it's important that I be here before you, that was true, but in a different way than he intended. So it was important that Yosef be an Eved before Bnei Yisrael were an Eved, and that prepares them for being Avadim and coming out as Malachim, the fact that he was an Eved and came in as a Melech, but not in the way that he described it in this pasuk. That's what I'm getting at, but I will show you all those pasukim. Okay, so far so good. If it's not, you could pipe up.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, let's go weiter. Now, I remember in that pasuk in Micha, it says the word paratz. So besides the fact that the word peretz is a very key word for Yehuda and kings, because he comes from Peretz, and that happens a lot in Sefer Shmuel, where we find David being selected. We have the word peretz repeating itself in the David stories, the verb peretz. But I also want to show you, look at the end of Amos, the end of Amos, Perek Tes Pasuk Yud Aleph. Here too, I remind you that this is a parak that we've been looking back to very often. Bayom hu akemet sukas David hanefeles. So this is referring to the fact that the brothers were neifel before Yosef, and Yehuda gets up and approaches him. V'godarti es pirtze hen. Okay, so here we have the word peretz. In order, leman yirshu es she'eres edom. So that they should inherit the she'eres edom. So you remember we have she'eres Yisrael. What was it in Micha again? In Micha, Perek Beis, Pasuk Yud. Beis, the she'eres Yisrael is going to be gathered together and brought back to Yisrael. And here the Yisrael is going to Yarshin she'eres Edom, b'chol hagoyim, asher nikra shmi alehem, whatever that means. It's complicated to read that. And in Pasuk Ches, it talks about the Mamlocha HaChatoah. So there's a Mamlocha HaChatoah, and they're going to be wiped out, and Beis Yaakov will not be wiped out. So there's the good kingdom as opposed to the bad kingdom. That's as we discussed the Mamlechas Koyanim. And weiter in Amos, Pasuk Yud Gimel there, Hine Yamim Ba'im Ne'um Hashem V'nigash Choresh Ba'koitzer. This is a reference to the 5 years that are not going to be Choresh V'kotzer. And this, the Medrash says, is Yehuda and Yosef. V'nigash, this V'nigash is a reference to Vayigash El of Yehuda. Yehuda is the Choresh and Yosef is the Kotzer. I forgot why. Okay. And there it talks about a return. B'shavti Yeshvus Am Yisrael. So the She'eris Yisrael, as it says in Micha, She'eris Yisrael is going to come back because their king goes before them. And because their king goes before them, therefore Hashem B'Reisham. The model of that, of course, is Yitzias Mitzrayim, where there's a She'eris. We survive the Galus of Mitzrayim. The She'eris Yisrael comes to Eretz Yisrael, and Hashem leads them. And the way that happened was because Yehuda and Yosef, their kings, went ahead of them. That's what earns them that Hashem should be B'Reisham. And similarly, we have here in the end of Amos that there's going to be a resurrection of the Sukkos David HaNefeles. It's the Machas Beis David. And again, the word Pirza, we have the right Mamlacha as opposed to the wrong Mamlacha, a combination between Yehuda and Yosef, and Nigash Choresh Ba'koitzer, and a return of Ami Yisrael. Okay. Fine. Now, I want to show you, okay, so what am I arguing basically? That if not for Yosef being sold as an Eved in advance, we wouldn't have survived the Galus. So what I'm going to do is, first I'll tell you my theory why that's the case, and then we'll go back to the Psukim, because you might be wondering why that's true. And this is based on the things we've been discussing since the beginning of Parshas Vayeshev in one form or another. Why is it, the question we're coming to answer is, why in fact did Yosef have to be sent before them in order for Bnei Yisrael to survive Galus Mitzrayim? Okay, the answer is as follows, I think. Yosef's shita is, Vayava Yosef, is captured in the words Vayava Yosef as Dibasam Ra'ah. That means Yosef holds we have to dabble in evil. We have to stir trouble. What's the point of stirring up trouble? Because if we limit ourselves to only doing that which we think is good, then we'll never learn that there's good that we can't fathom. So we have to do things that we don't think are good, we think are evil, so that Hashem could swoop in and make evil good out of evil, and we'll learn that there's all sorts of cool things that we didn't dream of. That is the Yosef theory. In other words, in order to say Atem chashavtem alai ra'ah, Elokim chashav ala toiva, which is the big chiddush of Yosef, that there's more in heaven and earth than your philosophy can contain, meaning we cannot know the Das Hashem fully, and it's always going to be more than we know. In order to make ourselves aware of the fact that there's always more Das Hashem than we know, we have to not act according to what we know, as if we have a perfect system of knowledge, which is to say we have to do Ra, and then allow new things to happen that now we understand that Hashem is greater than we thought. Okay. So, okay, let's resume here. Yes, so Yosef's shita is that you have to do things that are Ra, so that Hashem could come and do Toiv that you didn't fathom. Okay, now why is this so important for us to survive Mitzrayim? Because, this is my theory, Because in order to survive the evil of Mitzrayim, we have to believe that from evil good can come. In other words, we have to believe that evil can be justified. So in order for us to really truly believe that evil can be justified, we have to have had a person who embraced evil, lechatchila, and said this is something we can work with, such that when we face evil from evildoers, people who are interested in evil, we can remind ourselves that evil can turn into good. So basically, the point is that you needed a tzaddik to run this like controlled experiment of atem chashavtem alay ra'a lekim chashav l'toiva, in order to anticipate that which Yirmiyah talks about, the galus. We spoke about this at length, that he talks about in the galus Bavel that Hashem has machshavos of achros v'tikva, even though things seem so awful, and that's based on the Yosef story in Yirmiyah. The point is that in galus, when things seem ra, to say that they have an achros Toiv is learned out from Yosef. And I'm saying furthermore, it's learned out from Yosef means that you need Yosef to say that Ra is a good option, it's an important thing, in order for us to recognize when the Ra happens to us, Bal Korchenu, that the Ra has a good ending. So therefore Yosef being sent Lifnechem means simply that before we endure the Avdus of Mitzrayim, we need to have Yosef. We need to have Yosef enduring that same Ra in a way that he's going to say turns into Toiv, so that we can experience it and say, you know what, it's going to turn into Toiv. Okay, that's the theory. So, in other words, what Yosef is saying is like this: if not for me, you wouldn't have survived. But he's talking about surviving from the Rav. In truth, we wouldn't survive because we need someone to be an Eved before we are an Eved, in order for the She'eris Yisrael, that the Nevi'im talk about, the She'eris Yisrael to come back out of Golos, and the She'eris Yisrael to take over the She'eris of Edom. Okay, now I want to show you another thing. So in Amos Perek Hey, let's go to Amos Perek Hey, also a Perek we've been looking at, and there it says the following, Perek Hey, Pasuk Vav, let's start with that. Dirshu Hashem v'chyu pen yitzlach ka'esh beis Yosef va'achlavein v'chabel beis El. So, if you're not Derish Hashem, then beis Yosef might spread like a fire and consume beis El. So this is a destructive fire. Here, beis Yosef is a destructive fire. And beis Yosef is in danger of consuming everything. Look at Pasuk Tezvav, Sinu Rav, the same parak, Amos Perek Hey, Pasuk Tezvav, Sinu Rav ehevu toiv atzigu v'shar mishpat ula yechenan Hashem alekei tzavokos she'eris Yosef. So there's she'eris Yosef, there's a remnant of Yosef, and that's at risk of consuming itself, but we hope that Hashem is choyn in it, and here are the rules, Sinu Rav ehevu toiv atzigu v'shar mishpat. Okay. Fine. Good. And we already saw the end of Amos, Perek Tes Pasuk Yud Beis, that we're going to inherit She'eris Edom. Okay, so what we have in Amos is this She'eris Yosef, that we want Hashem to be Chaynein, that She'eris is going to inherit She'eris Edom, but if it doesn't do things right, then it will consume itself like a fire. Look in the next Sefer in Treas and Evadia, and there we have very similar points. Evadia Perek Pasuk Yud Zayin. Har Tzion is going to be a pleta. Remember, the end of Amos talks about the She'eris Edom. Of course, Evadia is all about Edom. And Evadia says that there's going to be a pleta on Har Tzion. The Yershu Beis Yaakov es Yoirashehem. The Beis Yaakov will yarshin its Moirashim. V'haya Beis Yaakov eish u'Beis Yosef lahava v'lo yisarid lebeis Esav. So here the theme of where is there going to be a pleta and where is there going to be a sarid, and the answer is it's going to be not Esav. Esav is not going to survive, and Beis Yaakov will be Moirish Shehem. They will have the pleta. Behar Tzion tia pleta v'haya kodesh. And we will yashin Edom, who will not have a sarid. So this is mamish like the theme of Amos, where it talks about the She'eris of Yosef is going to be Yoirish, the she'eris of Edom. Okay. And here in Avadia, Beis Yosef is like a flame that consumes Esav. In Amos, there's a risk that Beis Yosef is a fire that's going to consume itself. So I want to just say one word about that the idea that Yosef is a fire that could either consume the enemies or consume itself is because Yosef is dabbling in dangerous arts, which is the art of Ra. The nature of Ra is that it can either turn back on the one practitioner, or if he's someone like Yosef and plays it right, then it could be turned against the enemy who will not have a she'eris. And parenthetically, I'll explain that a little bit more in a moment, but parenthetically, in this week's parasha also, in Beshalach, it says, Lo nish'ar bohem ad echad. So there's a competition. Where is there going to be a she'eris? Are we going to survive, or is Mitzrayim going to survive? It's one or the other. Either, if we survive Mitzrayim, that's only going to be because none of us survives of them, and we need to have the antidote, or maybe the right word is more like a vaccine against Ra, because Yosef administered a dose of Ra under controlled conditions of a tzaddik who knows that the purpose of the Ra is for Toiv, and therefore we could survive the Ra of Mitzrayim and see that it's eventually going to turn into Toiv. Okay, about the point about Yosef is like a fire that could either consume himself or consume the enemy. So I just want to remind you something we darshened in Tehillim Kuf Chof and Tehillim Kuf Chof Zayin. See how much of this I remember clearly. But there in Tehillim Kuf Chof and Kuf Chof Zayin, we darshened it against parallel corresponding to Yosef and the brothers. In Tehillim Kuf Chof, it talks about the enemy who's like Chitze Gibor Shnunim, like sharpened arrows, and like Gachale Resamim. Gachale Resamim are coals that retain their heat inside but are not visibly hot. And this is a mashal for a Lashon Remiyah in Kapitel Kuf Chav. And Kapitel Kuf Chav talks about the people that want peace, but people speak to them with treachery and turn it into milchama, and they hate shalom. And we spoke about how this corresponds to Yosef, who brought Diba, and the brothers were soine him and couldn't speak to him l'shalom. Okay, and in Kuf Chav Zayin, it also talks about chitzim, and there it talks about the Bnei Hanaurim, the youths, who are like the children. Nachlas Hashem Bonim, they are like chitzim. The kids, without going into all the rayas, and there it also talks about speaking with the enemy in Kuf Chav Zayin. We said that there's two kinds of children in Bnei Israel, and there's a competition between the two kinds of children. Those are Yosef and the brothers. Eventually, everything comes together. They all come back together in Mitzrayim, and there it says in Kapitel Kuf Chav Ches, Urevonim levanecha shalom al Yisov vayiru Yosef of Bnei Ephraim Bnei Shalishim, and Yaakov sees not only Yosef but even his children. That's when we finally achieve shalom al Yisrael, when the family is united. But before that, there's this split where there's Yosef's Mahalach and there's the brothers' Mahalach. And they're all about figuring out how are we supposed to attain Shalom, but they all have their different paths towards Shalom. And the Bnei Hanaurim in Kuf Chav Zayin are like arrows. Yosef, who speaks Diba, is like sharpened arrows in Kuf Chav. Sharpened arrows. What's the difference between sharpened arrows and arrows? Arrows is a good thing, but sharpened arrows is a dangerous thing. Why? Because if your arrows are too sharp, then you're liable to harm yourself. You, the one who's wielding the arrows, if they're very sharp, they can end up hurting you. And the same thing applies to Gachle Resamim. Gachle Resamim, as I mentioned, are coals that are hot, but their heat is not visible. So if someone is using Gachle Resamim to attack an enemy, he's liable to burn himself. So too Yosef, who's nimshal to a lahava or an eish, is at risk, as we see in Amos, is at risk of either burning himself or burning the enemy. And the reason for that is because if you engage in pure taiv, instead of a lashon remiyah where things get gray and crooked, if your focus is only doing what's taiv, then there's no risk of harming yourself. But neither does that protect you against an evil person, because if you actually face an evil person, you have no idea what to do with it. In other words, as I was saying before, that we needed Yosef to inoculate us against the evil of Mitzrayim by giving us a kind of manageable dose of evil. But a manageable dose of evil is like playing with fire, and that could turn against you. So that's the remiyah, the remiyah, which in Tehillim is like an arrow, a very sharp arrow, that someone wields against his enemy but could harm himself, or a fire that could harm himself, Lashon Rumiyah means that is something that we refer to. It's how we refer to this concept of blurring the difference between true and false, or blurring the difference between Taiv and Ra through speech, and that could be very powerful, but it's also very dangerous, and that's exactly what Yosef's position is nimshal to. So Yosef is the one who guarantees a she'eris for the brothers, and that's what allows them to take the she'eris of the enemies, the she'eris of Edom. Okay, I want to say one more thing. It happens to be there's a few other places in Micha where we have she'eris, just to round this out. So we saw one in Beis Yud Beis. Just want to quickly show you the few other places in Micha where it talks about the she'eris, and it also relates to this kind of idea. So we had Beis Yud Beis, the she'eris Yisrael is going to be gathered back together. And then you see in Dalid Zayin, it talks about the Tzeileah, the limping one, is going to be a she'eris, and Hashem is going to rule them on Har Tzion. That's like we have over Har Tzion Tia Pleta in Evadia. And then in Hey Vav, V'haya she'eris Yaakov bekerev amim rabim. So again, we have the concept of the other nations and the she'eris of Yaakov. And there it's explicit in the next pasuk, pasuk Zayin, Parakeh pasuk Zayin, that the she'eris Yaakov is going to be like a lion among the other nations. So the she'eris Yaakov, like it says in the end of Amos, the she'eris of Yosef is going to take over the she'eris of Edom, v'chol hagoyim. That's like we have the same pasuk here in Micha. Hey Zayin, the she'eris Yaakov is going to take over the kerev amim rabim. And the last one is in Zayin Ches in Micha. I'm sorry, no, that was in Zayin Yud Ches. Right, the she'eris nachlaster. Okay. The she'eris is going to take over the other nations, right? That reminds us of Tehillim Kuf Hey, where it says Shalach Lefneim Ish Le'evanim Ka Yosef, and Tehillim Kuf Hey is telling us the overarching plan of Hashem, the overarching hashgacha of Hashem over the Avis, who vouched them Eretz Yisrael, and then there was a Rav, but he protected them through Yosef, and then he brought the Makas HaMitzrayim, etc., etc., etc. And the way the whole Mizmor ends is Vayiter Lehem Artzis Goyim Va'amal L'umim Yirashu. So the she'eris Yisrael has to survive because they are the ones who are going to vanquish the Goyim and the L'umim. Like the Nevi'im say, the she'eris Yaakov is going to be Bekerev Amim Rabim and going to take them over, and that's the final word. One last thing I want to say is that Yosef predicted there's another 5 years, Asher Ein Charish V'Kotzir, Shnasayim Hara'ov Bekerev Ha'aretz, and another 5 years, Asher Ein Charish V'Kotzir. Ultimately, as we said, it didn't happen. There wasn't another 5 years of Asher Ein Charish V'Kotzir. And perhaps this pasuk corresponds to it. The pasuk in Yeshaya Perek Yutes, which is a perek we had a lot at the beginning of Parashas Miketz, that predicts the downfall of Mitzrayim, and that perek ends with saying that Yisrael is going to be part of a trilogy of Hashem's people, which are Mitzrayim, Ashur, and Yisrael. Baruch Ami Mitzrayim u'Maaseh Yadai Ashur v'Nachlasi Yisrael. And there the pasuk says, second last pasuk in Perek Yutes in Yeshaya, Yisrael is going to be a shlishi of the Mitzrayim ul Ashur, bracha b'kerev ha'aretz. So Yosef predicted that there's going to be the downfall of Mitzrayim, which is how Yeshaya Perek Yutes starts as well. But eventually is going to be a return to Hashem within Mitzrayim. That's what it says in Yeshaya Perek Yutes. And then Mitzrayim is going to be called Ami. So similarly, Parei comes to Mitzrayim. Yaakov comes to Mitzrayim and he blesses Parei. He gives him a bracha. And because he gives him a bracha, Yosef's prediction of the 2 years of Rav Bekerev Ha'aretz and the next 5 years of Charish V'Kotzir comes to an end. And that's what Yeshaya says, that Yisrael is going to be a bracha Bekerev Ha'aretz, Asher Berche Hashem. So once the bracha of Hashem is brought to Mitzrayim, the whole story of Yosef's prediction about what's going to happen Bekerev Ha'aretz changes. Okay, and we will leave it at that.